Hello again, I'm Matthew Gore from lightandmatter.org, and for this video, my intention was to compare the new Sony 24mm f1.4 G Master lens with the Sigma 24mm f1.4 Art series lens in Sony E-mount. The Sony lens just started shipping this winter, and the Sigma is a few years old, but there are a couple of other obvious differences. The Sony is smaller overall, about 1 inch shorter and 75% lighter than the Sigma. The Sony also claims to be weather sealed, although I didn't test it. There's also a bit of a price difference. The Sony costs about $1,400, while the Sigma weighs in at about $850. I said my intention was to compare the lenses as usual, but something came up, or down I guess. It started to snow in Seattle. That might not seem like a big deal to people in most of the country, and I understand. I grew up in Montana. But in Seattle, a little snow on the roads shuts down everything. In fact, Federal Express wouldn't even deliver the Sony lens at first. So I ended up with the Sony lens for a week, but I couldn't do most of the shooting with it that I had intended. I did manage to get a few shots taken though, so I'll show you what I ended up with, and I hope you'll understand why this video is not quite as thorough as usual. To check out the resolution of these lenses, I headed out to Snoqualmie Falls to see what it would look like in the snow. I used a tripod and my normal testing procedures with a Sony A7R III, so these are 42 megapixel images. Starting in the center at f1.4, both lenses are wonderfully sharp. Looking at some of these fine branches here, and looking at these fine branches up here, it's just possible that the edges of the Sony are a bit sharper, but it's pretty much a toss-up. Stopping down to f2, there's a little improvement on both sides, and they both look great. I'd still give a slight edge to the Sony, which gives us a little more clarity in the fine texture in the rock, but it's still really close. At f2.8, it looks like I might as well be showing you the same photos as f2. I don't see much change on either side. Now, at f4, things are bad on the Sigma, obviously worse than the f2.8 shot. I figured I had bumped the tripod or something and replaced the image with a duplicate, and then 2 more duplicates and got the same thing each time, even though I refocused between each shot, and some of these were 10 frames away from each other. Stopping down to f5.6 though, the Sigma is sharp again, and they're indistinguishable as far as I can tell. And at f8, if there's any difference between the two, I can't tell which is better. Some details look a tad sharper on the Sigma, some on the Sony. It probably has more to do with the air currents around this waterfall than the lenses. Okay, so that's the center of the lens, but let's see how things look if we look a little bit more out towards mid-frame. Wide open, neither one is perfect out here, but they're both still pretty strong. The difference between them is more pronounced than it was in the center, with the Sigma a little softer than before. At f2, they're both a little sharper, but the Sony still has the advantage. The Sigma has a little bit of streaky blur. At f2.8, the Sigma sharpens up a bit and is getting pretty close to the Sony, but it's not quite there yet. At f4, the Sony looks excellent, though it was so good at f2.8 that I don't know if it's really better here, and of course the Sigma is soft. By f5.6, they both look about the same. The Sony might be a bit sharper, but it might just be that there's a little more contrast. And at f8, if they weren't identical before, I can't tell any difference here. Finally, if we look up here near the corner, we can see that the Sony is remarkably sharp up here for the corner of a wide-angle lens. The Sigma here looks soft and a bit smeary, and both sides have a bit of magenta fringing, though it's pretty well controlled. At f2, there are minor improvements on both sides, and the vignetting eases up quite a bit, so they look brighter. At f2.8, there's a significant improvement on the Sigma side, and the image quality is now on par for all practical purposes. As expected, the Sigma is blurry at f4, and the Sony still looks about the same as f2.8. At f5.6, both lenses are giving us excellent resolution, and there's no significant difference between them. And at f8, the two are still pretty indistinguishable. And then it started snowing, and obscured my view of the scene, and I eventually just had to drive home. To summarize though, the two lenses are very sharp in the center, with the very modest difference disappearing around f2.8. Away from the center, they're both a hair softer, but still quite good. The Sigma lags a bit further behind wide open, but catches up around f2.8. And in the corners of the image, the Sony is remarkably sharp wide open, while the Sigma has to be stopped down to f2.8 to look good, but it catches up around f5.6. But before I move on from this set of pictures completely, let me point out a couple of things that you've probably already noticed. These two pictures were taken from the exact same position, but if you take a look at the building in the top left corner, the Sony captures the whole thing, while the Sigma crops off a bit. So it should be pretty obvious that the Sony is actually a bit wider than the Sigma. To figure out roughly how much, I found a couple of set points in the upper left and lower right corners of the image, and I measured how far apart they are. On the Sony, it comes out to be 8,495 pixels, and on the Sigma, about 8,856. The math is pretty simple. It means that there's a difference of 4%. So if we assume that the Sony is a true 24mm lens, which is possible, then the Sigma is actually a 25mm lens. It's a pretty insignificant difference, but it is visible, so I thought it was worth mentioning. You've also probably noticed that there's a difference in color rendering between the two lenses. These images are set to the same color temperature, but the Sony is visibly cooler. This is the sort of thing that can be corrected pretty easily if you shoot RAW, or maybe if you just trust the auto white balance in your camera, but again, it's visible, so I thought I'd better give it a passing mention. I'm not sure how visible it'll be in a YouTube video. I did manage to get started on some autofocus testing with these lenses, shooting basketball, which is really the only sport that's practical to shoot with a 24mm lens. The focus with the Sony lens was just fine. When I locked onto a subject, I rarely got a frame that wasn't sharp, even when the players were just a few feet away from me. There were times like this, though, when I was using a manually selected focusing point, and the subject was so small in the frame that I couldn't keep the focusing point on her, so I missed focus, but that's not the lens's fault, that's just my mistake as a photographer. I didn't know what to expect from the Sigma, since I've never used an art lens on E-mount before to shoot action, but I had no problems with it. It grabbed focus quickly and tracked action just as reliably as the Sony. With the snow on the roads and the passes closed, I couldn't drive east of the mountains to shoot the night sky like I wanted to, and in fact, I couldn't really drive anywhere, so I had to settle for doing a little shooting at a local park. All of these shots were taken with the Sony. I was hoping that I'd run across some wildlife along the river, but I was still too close to the city, so all I got were shopping carts and dead bodies floating in the river. It might not have been enough time to get any great photographs, but I did use the Sony lens long enough to run into a serious annoyance with this design. This lens has a manual aperture ring. You can set it to A and use the automatic aperture, or you can turn it to set the aperture manually. There's even a D-click switch so that video shooters can use the aperture ring to make smooth transitions between light and dark scenes, which is great in theory. But I don't shoot video, and 90% of the time I'm shooting, I use aperture priority, and I prefer to control the aperture from the camera. Fine. But the problem is this. The aperture ring on this lens doesn't have a lock button to lock it in place in the automatic position like my old Nikon lenses have, for example. So as I'm walking around with the lens hanging at my side, the ring very easily gets bumped out of position. And when I need to quickly raise the camera to my eye and take a shot, I find that the aperture is at f16 or f11 instead of f1.4, and the shutter speed is so slow as a result that even the A7R III's in-body stabilization isn't enough to save my first couple of shots. This is a big enough problem that if I owned the lens, I'd have to keep a piece of gaffer tape on the lens to hold it permanently in place. And that's annoying with a $1,400 lens. The Sigma does not suffer from this type of problem, but it also doesn't have the potential benefits of a manual aperture ring. The only annoyance with the Sigma was carrying around the extra weight, but it also is missing the focus lock button that you'll find on Sony lenses. Now, before I wrap this up, I did also take a look at the vignetting of these lenses, and of course, they both have some visible vignetting when shot wide open, but the differences between these two lenses in this regard are not really worth mentioning. They look about the same to me. So where does that leave us? Well, the Sony is clearly the lighter and more compact lens, and it also is weather sealed, for whatever that's worth. And even though it can be annoying, the extra capabilities offered by the aperture ring and the focus lock button make the Sony the winner in the features category. Both lenses have great resolution, but where they're different, mostly at wide apertures, the Sony is better. Autofocus is just fine on both lenses, and there were no major differences in terms of vignetting. But there is that difference in cost, about $1,400 for the Sony and $850 for the Sigma, a difference of about $550. Despite the annoyance of having no lock on its aperture ring, the Sony is better than the Sigma in just about every way where there's a difference. But the difference in image quality is pretty modest, and they're both wonderfully sharp lenses. If you're shooting landscapes or other types of photography where resolution is critical near the edges, you'll also probably be stopped down far enough that the two lenses will produce identical resolution. And in the center, they're both nice and sharp, even wide open. The extra $550 that you'd need to buy the Sony could also buy you a second lens, maybe something like this excellent Sony 85mm f1.8 lens if you don't already own one. And having another lens like this will make a much bigger difference in your photography than a little extra resolution at the edges. So if you're at the stage in your career or hobby where it matters, it's worth thinking about. And that's it. Almost. Since you've made it this far, here are a couple more bits and pieces that you might find interesting. First, bokeh. I didn't shoot much to compare bokeh with these lenses, but I did shoot these stage lights, and I was pretty happy with what I got from both lenses. Looking at them close up, there are no obvious onion rings on either side, and the aberrations are all pretty well controlled. The edges are a little more contrasty on the Sigma in some areas, but not so much as to be distracting. Also, as I mentioned earlier, I had planned on shooting some starry skies with these things, because the Sony lens design is supposed to correct the coma that can create weird star shapes at wide apertures, which is a known issue with Canon and Sigma 24mm lenses. But I couldn't get east of the mountains, and you can't see the sky during the Seattle winter, so I didn't shoot them. But if night skies are your thing, then you might want to keep that in mind with the Sony. And finally, take a second to subscribe to my channel here. You don't even have to click the little bell if you're concerned that my video postings every other decade will overwhelm your inbox. But I think it would be awesome if I could get my channel up to 50,000 subscribers, and we're getting close. And that's it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.